We're going through Lab 8, the bones of the axial skeleton. So bones that are found within the skull, the spine, the rib cage, the sternum, and there's also a select bone that's in the area of the throat, and also the middle ear bones are included. So we're starting here now with what's known as the bony orbit, and there are 7 bones collectively. And we'll go through figures from the textbook and photographs of models. So starting here with the bony orbit, that's the area of the eye socket. And the list of bones, there's a little neat mnemonic, the please feed my zebra, palatine, lacrimal, ethmoid, sphenoid, frontal, the maxillary, and zygomatic bones, making up that list. So learning the list here of names, we don't necessarily have to point out each little bone in the socket, but just knowing the list of names there. So now moving along, we have these features as the carotid canal and jugular foramen. And to begin here, canal and foramen, these always describe some small hole, a small opening going through a bone. And we're going to see these on the inferior side. So here's just a photograph of that bony orbit. And here with this image, we can see now the features of the carotid canal and the jugular foramen. So we see this small hole that we're looking at here following the label. It's the carotid canal. And of course, it's on each side. They're in a pair. And now the hole directly posterior and lateral to it. So we see it here unlabeled and on the opposite side. That is the jugular foramen. Posterior, more lateral and larger. And from a photograph, we're able to see those same locations. We'll label this here. We have the area of the carotid canal. And directly posterior it is the jugular foramen. We have the term bony orbit once again, the bones making the area of the eye socket, as well as the bones of the nasal septum. So just another look at that bony orbit, the eye socket. Now the nasal septum is a feature made of 2 distinct bones. The inferior portion of the septum is made from the bone known as the vomer. Inferior and the superior portion is the ethmoid bone, seen here in green. Specifically, it's the detail of the perpendicular plate that's hanging down. And together, that all makes that medial nasal septum. And seeing it here on the skull. So here's an area of that nasal septum. There's now the next term, calvaria. And the calvaria is just simply when we saw open the skull. So this has to be dissected to see this feature. And it's all of this superior portion, just depending on where the cut is made. It's all of that superior portion of the cranium. So now we're just going to continue with this list. And we have the textbook figures that are color-coded or helpful, but will be tested on using the photographs of the skull. So starting with the frontal bone, of course, the bone right here on the forehead. And we'll just stay with the pictures and go down the list. So beginning here with the frontal bone, so the area of the frons, the forehead. The next bone, the paired parietal bones. So right at the superior aspect of the cranium. At the posterior portion, there's the occipital bone, the posterior portion of the cranium. You could look for the ear canal. That's a good indication for the temporal bone on the lateral side of the cranium. The sphenoid bone, we see here a portion of it from the lateral side. The sphenoid bone is a portion of the bony orbit, a portion of the eye socket as well. So to see those same bones here, again, frontal bone, parietal, there's a pair, occipital bone. There are the paired temporal bones, and you could follow that outline right here to see that shape of it. And the sphenoid bone. And we see a portion of it here. And there's a bone known as inferior nasal concha. And we'll start here with the labeling. We're looking inside the nasal cavity. And they're in a pair once again. Inferior nasal concha. We're looking at just one. So now we'll go into the details of the various bones. So we'll go back to the frontal bone. And we see the little hole here. We've already introduced the term foramen. It's pretty descriptive, superior to the orbit, superior to the eye socket. Detail on the frontal bone, a supraorbital foramen. The parietal bones, there's no details that we're concerned with, just simply naming parietal bones. For the occipital bone, we'll go to now this detail here. And we have this another hole, but in this case, implying that it's a very big hole. There's a foramen magnum. Lateral to the foramen magnum, these rounded bulges here. These are the paired occipital condyles. And then now posterior to that, we're looking for this arch here that I'm highlighting. And this is known as superior nuchal line. And this bone now is rotated the opposite way, but we still have foramen magnum flanked by the occipital condyles. And we can start right here as a guide and just follow that arch across here. And that's where we're able to see a superior nuchal line. Onto a temporal bone. You notice here we're on the lateral side of the skull. You can see that ear canal as a good landmark. And the term for that, external acoustic meatus. The name for the ear canal. We have this protrusion poking out here, and we'll see this word many times, a process, something that protrudes and sticks out. In this case, posterior to the external acoustic meatus, the mastoid process. Pointing anteriorly, there's a zygomatic process. Inferiorly, a styloid process. And then lastly, we have this term, a fossa is a recessed, shallow depression. And that's known as a mandibular fossa. You can notice how the mandible bone makes a joint right there at that mandibular fossa. And to see the photograph, we have the external acoustic meatus, the mastoid process. So we want the process portion specifically. The zygomatic process. There's the styloid process on this figure. Appears to be broken off of this row one, which is typical. And here, a mandibular fossa. The mandibular fossa. And this is a medial view that we do not need. So we could ignore this. So next, moving on to the sphenoid bone. And we have a view of it here. And we have the bigger branches known as greater wings, and the smaller branches, the lesser wings. Again, once again in a pair. Between the two wings, so the space between the two wings is known as the superior orbital fissure. So that crevice between the two wings. If we go back to the lesser wing itself, and we'll just remove some of the writing, the small hole passing through the lesser wing is known as the optic canal. This deep groove that we see here on the superior side of the bone, and that's the view we have here looking down onto it. This deep groove is the sella turcica. And another view of the sphenoid bone, and kind of an easy way to remember it here. Greater wings, lesser wings up top. The gap between the wings, that superior orbital fissure. And what we get from this view now, we're able to see the pterygoid processes. So these inferior extensions here, the legs of the bat, the pterygoid process. And we have a photograph here. So one more time, the bigger branches are greater wings, the superior, smaller, lesser wings, and that's the indication. Lesser, smaller in size, greater, the larger of the pair. The crevice between the wings, superior orbital fissure. We're able to see the inferior pterygoid process. So it's both branches together where they meet, that whole thing, pterygoid process. And to get the superior view, we're able to see again the optic canals running through the lesser wing and the groove of the sella turcica. And the last one for this first page, the inferior nasal concha. So here we are just seeing it on the textbook illustration. So the inferior lateral portion of the nasal cavity, we're seeing those paired bones, inferior nasal conchae, and seeing it on the skull right in here once more. So that'll finish this first page, and we'll continue on. So moving into the ethmoid bone and its details, and then on to the face. So starting with a textbook figure, the perpendicular plate is this inferior portion. This makes a portion of that nasal septum, that superior section of the nasal septum. However, the superior portion of the ethmoid bone itself, we're seeing this surface here with all the holes in it. The entire flat surface, that's known as cribriform plate. It's that flat surface with the holes, cribriform plate. And the protrusion sticking upwards from that spike is known as a crista galli. We have a figure now. That spike of the crista galli, the perpendicular plate hanging down in the medial section of the bone. And now lateral to that perpendicular plate, the branches of the middle nasal concha. A term that's not on the list, so let's not add. We have the bones of the face. So we're looking at just the nasal bone, recognizing that bony bridge of the nose. The superior row of teeth develop in this bone. It could be called maxilla or maxillary. So that's the maxilla. There's the cheekbone. It's the name for the zygomatic bone. We could see here on this figure, skipping down a few on the page, the lower jaw is the mandible. The lacrimal bones we see right here as part of that bony orbit. So that very small bone there in the skull. On the medial side of the bony orbit. And taking a look at those first few. So of course the nasal bone, the maxilla, superior portion of the jaw, the cheekbone, the zygomatic bone, the lacrimal bone. Let's get rid of the writing there. So we can see that lacrimal bone, again, right there in the medial side of the eye socket. And the lower jaw, of course, all the mandible. So now going back to the maxilla to see some detail. We have this inferior view. We're looking up at the cranium with the mandible removed. And we can see the maxilla here highlighted in orange. And the anterior roof of the mouth, this segment here, specifically that's the palatine process of the maxilla. And we can see that here, the maxilla itself with the teeth, and it's this anterior portion here is the palatal process. There's the zygomatic bone once more, and this posterior edge of it specifically, where it connects to the temporal bone. You notice that's named the temporal process, that posterior edge of the zygomatic bone. And we're able to see that feature here specifically. So just this posterior portion, the temporal process. Going back to the nasal septum, the inferior portion of the nasal septum, that's the bone, the vomer. And just a look here. So with this mid-sagittal section, we can see the wedge shape. That's the meaning of the word vomer, that plow wedge shape of the vomer. So of course we're able to see that here. That medial inferior portion right there in the nasal cavity. The inferior portion of the nasal septums, the vomer. The palatine bones, we just referenced the palatine process of the maxilla, the anterior portion of the hard palate. Now posterior to it here in yellow, so that very posterior edge of our hard palate, that's a distinct and separate palatine bone. Back to the bony orbit region, we can see the majority of the palatine bone seen right here in the area of the hard palate. So the majority of the palatine bones located there. And a small portion, of course, is located in the bony orbit. Moving on to the lacrimal bone, and we have that detail, the nasolacrimal groove. We're just looking for the little notch right here. It's where our tear ducts are located. And we once again see the lacrimal bone, and I'll just highlight right where the groove is located. nasolacrimal groove. We have the inferior portion of the jaw, the mandible. And starting on the lateral portion, there's the term a ramus. A process is thin typically, and a ramus is a thicker projection. So we're looking at all of this area here for the ramus. And now inferior to the teeth, truly the area of our chin, all of that area inferior to the teeth is known as the body for the mandible. Going back to the ramus, we see how it splits into these separate sections here. And that's where we have the anterior one that has more of a spike to it. That's the coronoid process. And the one that ends in more of a rounded bulge, the posterior condylar process. The mental foramen, again, foramen's a hole, and mental, that's the term for chin, the mentis. So right here, the two holes that are in the body, that's the mental foramen. Whereas the term alveolar process, these form the sockets for our teeth. So since all the teeth are in place, the alveolar processes are filled with the roots of the teeth. So we would just highlight that just right about here for that detail. And a closer look at the bone. So again, the lateral portions, that's the ramus, all the area of our chin, that's all the body region. And the holes contained within, that's the mental foramen. We have the ramus, and as it branches to both a coronoid process and a condylar process. We're just seeing an alternate name here, mandibular condyle or condylar process. And the alveolar process or alveolar margin, and you can see there that highlighting is already present, the sockets for the teeth. There's a hyoid bone. Here's a couple of different images to see the location. So we're looking in the area of the throat, we realize here, superior to the larynx. And here, just in reference with the muscles, the location of the hyoid bone. And here's an isolated hyoid bone. No details to recognize. So now moving to the fetal skull detail. What we're looking for now, these fontanelles, these larger areas that have yet to ossify and develop bone. So great example, this fetal skull, and of course, very, very early in infancy, lacking that suture bone to fill in the gaps there. So we'll start with the list for the fetal skull details, and there's a number of alternate names. So going right down the list in our lab manual, the frontal fontanelle, also known as anterior fontanelle, this big one here. Anterior or frontal fontanelle. Sphenoidal fontanelle, we notice the location of the sphenoid bone. So on the lateral portion of the skull, also known as anterior lateral or sphenoidal fontanelle. Anterolateral or sphenoid fontanelle. We have now also on the lateral side, closer to the back. So hence the name posterior lateral fontanelle, posterior lateral fontanelle, or mastoid fontanelle. Occipital fontanelle, here near the occipital bone. And again, alternate name, posterior fontanelle or occipital fontanelle. And then lastly, a frontal suture. We're looking at the frontal bone, which does develop as a right and left component. But very early still in our development, there's that prominent suture splitting down the middle. So that's the frontal suture as the two halves start to bind. And now viewing the figure here, we'll start right with that frontal suture. Again, the suture is the thin line, that division where the bones are bonding, as opposed to the bigger gap, again, frontal fontanelle or anterior fontanelle. We're able to see the sphenoid fontanelle and the mastoid fontanelle. So now moving on to the sutures of the adult cranium. So once that suture bone's developed and tightly bonded the major skull bones together, running in the coronal plane or the frontal plane, we see the name correctly is coronal suture. So that bonding between the frontal and parietal bones is that coronal suture. The squamosal suture is on the lateral side of the cranium. So we're seeing this here between temporal and parietal bones is that squamosal suture. Lambdoidal suture on the posterior aspect. And we're seeing that lambdoidal suture between occipital and parietal bones, bonding them together. Sagittal suture running right down the midline, right in the mid-sagittal plane, bonding the two parietal bones together. And a final one on the list, intermaxillary suture. This is now bonding the two halves of the maxillae, these two separate bones fusing together at that intermaxillary suture. And go into the photographs. So we're able to see, of course, the coronal suture. We have the area of the sagittal suture, branching to the lambdoid suture. You notice right here, good example of one of those suture bones, those bigger fragments. I could highlight the squamosal suture for you and make that a little more obvious. Right there is that squamosal suture. Again, between parietal and temporal bones. Squamosal suture. Closer look at the sagittal suture, lambdoid suture. And then lastly, we'll draw in that intermaxillary suture. The intermaxillary suture. And that'll complete this page. So now we're moving into the area of the vertebrae. We're on to page 6 here. Moving into the vertebrae. And we have the first term, intervertebral foramen, so we know it's a hole. Enter, the prefix meaning between. So between adjacent vertebrae, there's a hole. And we see that here on the lateral side of the vertebrae. So again, we need at least two vertebrae together, stacked. And we can see the multiple canals here. Is that intervertebral foramen. Foramina is just a plural word for multiple foramen, foramina. So now moving into the list for the typical vertebral landmarks, meaning the traits that most vertebrae have. And for this section, we want to use a lumbar vertebra just the bigger sized, large vertebrae is best suited for seeing the typical traits. So to begin, the large anterior mass of the bone, that's the vertebral body. This sits between intervertebral discs. Multiple processes, so sticking out laterally to the side. There's the paired transverse processes. And we see the region really between the transverse process and the vertebral body. I'll circle it right here. This is an area known as a pedicle. So directly posterior to the body is that pedicle. And they're in a pair. So now I'll highlight here these two areas. These are the laminae. And these two laminae are paired, and then they come together and they meet and form the spinous process. The vertebral foramen, that's the vertical canal running through the bone, is that vertebral foramen. So of course the spinal cord's running through there. And to finish off with the superior and inferior articular processes. So from the superior side, protruding upwards, hence the name superior articular process. And from the inferior side, that's where we have the inferior articular process. Both of those are in pairs, right and left. So now going to a bone, we can start with the vertebral body, or just simply called body. That's sufficient. The transverse processes sticking out laterally. There's now the area of the pedicle. We have the label right here for the pedicle region. And then we have the laminae. They fuse to come together and form that spinous process region. The open canal, the vertebral foramen. And we're looking, of course, from a superior view, looking down onto it. So we have protruding upwards here. This is a superior articular process, is the portion that we want. The facet is referring to the smooth surface. Just the general area that's sticking up is superior articular process is what we want. And then opposite that, inferior articular processes on each side. And just a lateral view. Here is a better look at that superior articular process. From the body, protruding posteriorly is that pedicle. And again here, there's the inferior articular process, the whole protrusion, which is the term that we want. The facet, again, is just referencing that smooth surface. We have a spinous process and a transverse process. So now after the typical traits, we're now going to the specifics of different sets of vertebrae. You know, the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, the sacrum, and then all the way down to the tailbone, the coccyx. So the superior 7 vertebrae, those are the cervical vertebrae. And of those 7, the first 2 have specific names. The most superior vertebra, atlas, inferior to that, axis. Axis has a particular detail on it. And then the inferior cervical vertebra, C7, it has a unique name for its spinous process, known as the vertebra prominens. Just a special name for its own spinous process since it's rather long. So that'll move us to here. So starting with the general traits of cervical vertebrae. So to recognize the cervical vertebra, one thing they all have in common is, well, each vertebra has a vertebral foramen, but all cervical vertebrae have these two additional canals on the sides. So if it has 3 holes total, that's got to be a cervical vertebra. So now taking a look at the atlas, we want to go there first, the atlas. The most superior of the cervical vertebrae. That's seen here. So we notice at the very superior portion of the neck, cervical number 1, known as atlas specifically, and recognizing that unique shape of this bone. It's lacking a number of the typical traits, but like all cervical vertebrae, there's 3 holes in it. Inferior to that, C2, that's known as the axis. That's the unique name here. And it has this distinct feature known as a dens, this spike, this protruding superiorly, is that dens. And we have a photograph here to recognize the atlas. And of course, our skull, specifically our occipital bone, will rest right here. This little bone here holds up the entire skull, atlas. And inferior to that, here's a view of the axis. And we can really see that trait of the dens, that feature. For vertebral prominence, we would have all cervical vertebrae together for that comparison. And again, this distinct name for this particular spinous process being much longer in comparison, you notice here. And with all the 7 cervical vertebrae together, again, we can see that vertebral prominence. Whereas all the other ones just get the typical name, spinous process. Thoracic vertebrae are now unique. Our 12 thoracic vertebrae are the only vertebrae that connect to our 12 pairs of ribs. So there's the unique features for that connection, and that's what the costal facets are. So we notice here, there's a paired costal facets, and these are at the posterior edge of the vertebral body. And on the transverse process as a whole, we're looking for that notch on the anterior side, and that's known as a transverse costal facet. And our ribs form joints with each of those. And we can see it here. So a thoracic vertebra has that distinct appearance. You notice the spinous process really sloping downwards, but we can see the costal facets. And on the transverse process, that smooth surface there, transverse costal facet. And then moving on to the lumbar vertebrae. Again, for the lumbar vertebrae, we just want to be able to recognize the large size of a lumbar vertebra, as well as learning the typical traits. So I'll just go right back to here. So where we studied the typical traits for most vertebrae, that's what we want to study using the lumbar vertebrae. And so that moves us along to the sacrum. We're now at the area of the pelvis at this point. A major part of the pelvis is the sacrum. So that's this large piece all together here that's fused together as one sacrum. And the superior canal coming in from the superior side is the sacral canal. The lateral aspect of the bone, truly where it connects onto our larger coxal bones. This is known as an auricular surface due to its shape kind of looking like an ear, auricular surface on the lateral side. The sacral hiatus is now the opposite inferior opening, sacral hiatus. The sacral canal runs all the way down and exits out the sacral hiatus. Sacral foramina, again, the plural word for foramen, all of these holes running through from anterior to posterior, running through the bone. And on the posterior side of the bone, this ridge here is the median sacral crest. And seeing that again. So again, multiple sacral foramina from the anterior view. We're able to see that auricular surface here from the lateral side. And from the posterior view, the superior canal is sacral canal running out at the sacral hiatus. And that elevated ridge, median sacral crest. And the final portion of the vertebrae are the bones fused together to make the coccyx, the tailbone. So now continuing on to the rib cage, we have the 12 pairs of ribs, starting from the most superior, 1 through 7. These are known as true ribs. And the remaining ribs, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. These are false ribs. And within the false ribs, specifically just numbers 11 and 12, they are now by themselves known as floating ribs. Costal cartilage, that's now the hyaline cartilage that's found between the ribs and the sternum. So here it's all represented kind of in this brown color, the costal cartilage. And we can see that here. So again, ribs 1 through 7 are all true ribs. Ribs 8 through 12, all known as false ribs. And then specifically just 11 and 12 by themselves, more specific name, floating ribs. The name comes from the true ribs, you notice. Each true rib has its own section of costal cartilage, bonding it to the sternum. Once we get to the false ribs, you notice how the false ribs now start to share the same piece of costal cartilage. And then specifically the floating ribs have no connection at all to costal cartilage. And here's just a view from the posterior side to really see that, especially for the floating ribs that do not at all connect to costal cartilage or the sternum. And now looking at an individual bone, a single rib, we have the very kind of blunt side that would connect to the costal cartilage. It's closer to the sternum, hence the name, the sternal end. The opposite of that is the vertebral end. And here we see a thoracic vertebra with those costal facets and transverse costal facets. And you can see how the ribs make a joint with each of those locations. So this entire side here is the vertebral end. Specifically the bump here, that's the tubercle. The neck is now this narrowed area just beyond the tubercle, that narrowed area of the neck. And the costal groove, we're looking on the inferior side of the rib, and we're just looking at that notch here on the inferior border of the rib. And we have some views here. So we're able to see the sternal end of the rib. The opposite of that would be this side over here is the vertebral end. We can see that area of the tubercle. And just beyond that, the narrowed area puts us here at the neck. And the costal groove, that's what we're going to see right along here. And let's see another view of this. Much better here. So to point out the tubercle, and then right along here is where we're going to see that costal groove. The vertebral end, a better view of that narrowed neck. And the opposite end, the sternal end. So this takes us to the end of the page 6. And the final part for this lab 8, the details of the sternum, and then ligaments that are connected to the vertebrae, as well as the details of intervertebral disc. So that'll bring us here for the sternum. So we have the entire breastbone, the sternum, that develops, of course. However, there are distinct segments to it. So the 3 different pieces, there's a superior manubrium, the midsection is the body, and this inferior point is a xiphoid process. And all 3 of these bond together to make a sternum. So this develops as an adult. A detail on the manubrium is now this little groove right here on the superior side, and that's known as a jugular notch. And going to the photograph here, we can see that jugular notch, that superior segment of the manubrium, the midsection of the body, and here's that developed xiphoid process. For the final section of the lab, we'll be using textbook images right here for the ligaments on the vertebral column. So the first one that we need to see, this first one here, ligamentum nucha, we'll omit this one since it's not on this figure, and we'll stick with the rest of these right from the figure to make this a little easier. So skipping ligamentum nucha, the supraspinous ligament, we see this at the very posterior edge of the spinous process, that supraspinous ligament. Deep to that, we now have the multiple segments, collectively known as the interspinous ligament. So it's found deeper in. Ligamentum flavum, we notice this is now located on the posterior side of the vertebral foramen. So the large canal here, vertebral foramen, and along the posterior edge of it is where we have the ligamentum flavum. There's the posterior longitudinal ligament. So this is running against the posterior side of the vertebral body. So we can see that labeling here, over here, posterior edge of vertebral body. And the anterior longitudinal ligament, of course, this is along the anterior side of the vertebral body. And then lastly, with the intervertebral disc, these pads of fibrocartilage between the vertebral bodies. And there's the deeper internal portion, the nucleus pulposus, which is much more fluid. And the more superficial, tougher, stronger, the ring, hence the name, annulus fibrosus. And just an alternate look at that would be like so. The outer annulus fibrosus versus the deeper nucleus pulposus. And this final figure here, just FYI, is showing a damaged, compressed, or the word is herniated disc. And you can see how it's really bulging and distorted. So the nucleus pulposus, the inner deep portion, and the external superficial annulus fibrosus.